Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. Congratulations, you've just spent the last 6 agonizing months dodging scurvy, sleeping in a horribly damp hammock, but hey, it has finally paid off. You've actually captured a Spanish galleon loaded with enough gold bullion to buy a sprawling manor in London and just completely retire 10 times over. You are sitting there in a cabin, surrounded by fine silk and a chest of emeralds that literally cost more than your very first merchant ship. I mean, it sounds like the absolute ultimate dream, right?
Well, here's the massive, unavoidable problem. You just captured a Spanish galleon. So now what? As you stand there watching the sunrise over the Caribbean, it suddenly hits you. The men out on the deck, they aren't cheering for your tactical genius. No, they are silently, coldly weighing their shares against yours. You might think you're rich and free, but the harsh reality is you haven't slept in 3 days. Why? Because in this world, trust is a fatal weakness you simply cannot afford. Being a pirate isn't just about grabbing the treasure. It's a deeply clinical game of high-stakes logistics and raw survival.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates exactly why you joined this shadow economy in the first place. You know, this lifestyle usually starts out of pure boredom and frustration. Picture a rainy Tuesday in a dreary port town. You're a merchant sailor who just realized that honest work is basically an incredibly slow way to starve, especially when the crown swoops in and takes 90% of your earnings. It's wild. You eventually realize that value is just something you can create out of thin air, provided you're willing to step completely outside the system and become a made man. So today, we are gonna deconstruct this cutthroat game of oceanic logistics. Here's our agenda. 1. Welcome to shadow economies. 2. Levels 1 and 2. 3. Middle management of the ocean. 4. The supreme pirate boss. And finally, 5. The price of absolute power. Let's kick things off with Section 1. Welcome to shadow economies and the Articles of Blood. See, the very moment you step outside the traditional system, the only law that actually matters is the set of articles you signed her name to in blood. A pirate ship is definitely not some chaotic free-for-all like you see in the Hollywood movies. It is a highly structured hierarchy made up of 5 very distinct levels. You've got the swab, the able seaman, the specialist, the quartermaster, and finally, the pirate captain. And you have to survive every single one of these steps if you want to reach the top. Moving right along to Section 2, Levels 1 and 2, the grunts of the shadow economy. Starting at the very bottom, we see the truly harsh reality of the lower decks. This is where you are constantly being watched to see if you even have the discipline to survive. At Level 1, you are the swab. Your feet are covered in sores, your straw sandals fell apart weeks ago, and you're crammed into a holding space with 50 other guys. You are treated like invisible furniture. Your entire job is to scrub the deck until it gleams, fetch the grog, and take literally all the risk during a boarding party while the officers stay safely behind the line. Oh, and you do all of this for $0. But if you pass that brutal test and manage to keep your mouth shut, you level up to the able seaman. You aren't scrubbing the decks anymore. You have officially graduated to the actual hustle. You're the one climbing the rigging in the middle of a storm, and you're the one pulling the trigger during a high-stakes raid. But listen, as an able seaman, there are some strictly enforced golden rules. The money you plunder? Yeah, it isn't actually yours. Every single time you raid a merchantman, you have to kick up a massive portion of your loot straight to the quartermaster. If you try to play games and hide even a tiny single rounding error of gold in your boot, you are stealing from the family. And in this particular business, thieves either get violently reformatted or they end up found stuffed in a barrel. It's really that simple. Now for Section 3, Middle Management of the Ocean, running the front companies. Okay, so if you manage to survive the grime and the violence of those lower decks, you finally trade your cutlass in for a technical role. Welcome to Level 3, the Specialist. Maybe you're the carpenter, or maybe the gunner. You aren't fighting in the bloody alleys anymore. Now you are basically a magician managing the ship's front companies, meaning the armory and the hull itself. At this stage, you start to realize the crew is actually just a complex business, and you are the one performing absolute mental gymnastics to keep the machine running and the ship afloat. Sure, you get a bit of respect, but the pressure, it's immense. If a mast snaps in a storm or a cannon unexpectedly explodes during a fight, it is literally your head on the block. Ascending to Level 4, you become the quartermaster. You are, for all intents and purposes, the COO of the ocean. You don't touch the guns anymore. Instead, you manage the critical insulation between the captain and the crew. You act as HR and diplomacy to settle fiery disputes and prevent mutinies long before the blades ever start flying. You handle the accounting, which means dividing the cake of the plunder and managing a perfectly transparent ledger. And that transparency is absolutely crucial because if the men think they're being shorted even a little bit, you are the very first person they're throwing overboard. And above all, you are the diplomat carrying unwritten messages to insulate the captain.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Supreme Pirate Boss, achieving the crown.
You've made it. As the supreme boss at level 5, you are basically a ghost. You never even have to touch a single doubloon from a deal because you have layers upon layers of people standing between you and the grime. You can just whisper an order to your quartermaster, and 3 days later, a rival ship simply disappears. But true power brings extreme, suffocating paranoia. You live in what's known as the Great Cabin. It's this high-walled kingdom aboard the ship where you are effectively a prisoner of your own wild success. You can't walk the deck without 40 attendants watching your every single move. In fact, you haven't even opened a door for yourself since taking the crown.
And that leads right into our final section, Part 5, the price of absolute power, the expensive loose end. This brings us to the chilling climax of this whole hierarchy, the moment where the grand illusion of total pirate freedom just completely shatters. The daily reality of level 5 is an absolute terrifying isolation. You might have an entire chest of gold sitting right there in your cabin, but you can't go to a park, you can't go to a grocery store. You wake up every single morning and immediately check your horizon for trackers. You are constantly changing your burner signals every single week. And why? Because you are now a very, very expensive loose end. You are the only person who can connect the entire crew to all of their crimes, which makes you the absolute biggest liability to everyone around you. So the real crucial takeaway here is this. You're just a number being moved to a different column on someone else's spreadsheet. By reaching the ultimate peak of this shadow economy, you realize you've completely lost your free will. You are simply waiting around for the inevitable moment when you become a rounding error that needs to be deleted by someone else aiming for your spot. It's a truly fascinating look at the hidden costs of extreme power, right? It's an identity you'd probably never actually want to live out in reality. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to drop in the comments. If you were the Pirate King, sitting paranoid in that great cabin, what is the very first rounding error you'd spend your gold on to make it all worth it?